Okay, so to sort of make this our final summary, some of this we've already gone over. The mountain range, again, this is part of the system of the Americas with these north-south mountain ranges, which means, and they also act as water storage. So that then allows, consistent, persistent water moving both west and east, especially in North America. So what you get are these enormous water catchment systems, which allow enormous amounts of water to flow through. And again, North America, both Canada, but especially the United States, like Europe, has one of the enormous advantages of having massive river systems, and the river systems are accessible. Whether it be the Great Lakes in Canada or the US, or whether it's the Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio rivers, the Columbia River in the West. You've got these massive river systems that are, basically generated by these mountain range water storage systems that allow movement very, very easily. And so what you get both with indigenous populations in the Americas, moving around long distances was not an issue. People were moving all over the place all the time. And when the Europeans arrive and quote colonize North America, they very quickly jump on this same scenario. And again, you get this movement throughout the Americas using rivers. And a classic example would be the Lewis and Clark expedition from the early United States, I don't know, 1804, something like that, basically going all the way to the West Coast and almost entirely based on rivers. They could have never walked that sucker, they would have died. But by using rivers, it was easy to transport large amounts of goods and resources, relatively speaking, and make these enormous distances in a very, very short period of time. And it's again, one of the great advantages the Americas have, more so than South America. In South America, you've got like the Amazon and Orinoco and places like that. You've got huge river systems, but it's largely in the tropics. So it doesn't really access the network of resources in the same way that you do in North America. So North America, the river systems and the movement of fresh water is enormously responsible for the, social economic movement and economic development of North America, especially the United States. It doesn't really get enough recognition. I mean, usually the only time you ever hear anything about rivers here is when they flood, without the realization the other 11 months of the year, a huge part of what you buy, sell, and move around the United States is based on, barges and stuff moving up and down rivers. One of those interesting side effects of this is because you have this system in place, even more so than in Europe, what you get in North America with the European arrivals, specifically the British and such, is the idea that people can dominate nature. It's oftentimes been said, I think people tend to sort of forget this, especially Americans, that all Americans, with the exception of indigenous Americans, which are a very small percentage of the population, are migrants. You can get into an argument about how long they've been here. Are they, first generation migrants or third generation migrants or eighth generation migrants? But they're all migrants. My particular family history, not that it's that relevant, but part of the family is Native American, so Arapaho Cheyenne. But that same family married in with a population of Dutch that moved to Pennsylvania in the late 1600s. And then my mom's side of the family, the dad was from the Ukraine and the mom was from England. So she was, first generation born in the United States. My dad's side of the family had been here in part for at least 15,000 years and probably 400, 500 years. But with the exception of the Native American part, they're all migrants. And this is hugely different than what we see in the rest of the world, especially when you think of places like China. You have populations moving around the landscape. But in many cases, the population has been there for a really long time in the same place. So this idea that everyone is from somewhere else. And in many ways, when you look at Americans, you realize that we have this very strong sense of the other place almost being home. Celebrating St. Patrick's Day, for example, really doesn't make any sense from the standpoint of someone who's Irish American, because what you're celebrating is sort of the Irish link. And to a certain extent, you're celebrating Ireland. And so ethnic identity in the United States is very heavily tied to where people were from. And you frequently get this if many of you move to the mainland. One of the things people will ask you is where you're from. And if you say, oh, I was born in the US, then they're going to persist. They'll say, well, no, where's your family from? They're going to want to know where your, what they would probably call your ethnic roots are from. And it's a fascinating concept because in most of the world, you would never ask that question because people, if you're Japanese, where Japanese are from. You might not be sure what part of Japan, but there's no question about them being from the Japanese islands. So one of the side effects of this, however, in a rather incredibly negative way, as if you remember your Suzuki presentation at the very beginning of the semester, is the fact that in North America, most specifically in the United States, there's not a strong sense of relationship to place. Americans move on average between every 3 and 5 years. This is probably shrinking a little bit with the massive increase in home prices, but Americans are incredibly migratory. Most Americans, by the time a kid's graduated from high school, his or her family will have moved 3, 4, maybe 5 times in that lifetime, which is incomprehensible to almost everyone else on the planet. And so this means that when you move to a new home for a new house, your sense of identity at that place is very limited. You don't have a sense, you probably know nothing about the names that were attached to that place in the past. You almost know nothing about the history of that place. In fact, I challenge most of you to know the history of your place. There's not a sense of relationship to the place. And so therefore changing the place or modifying that landscape or doing something to it makes perfect sense. And you see this in a classic way with the American West, because one of the terrible side effects of the American disrelationship with nature and place is that the idea that nature and the landscape is basically just a resource you can tap and exploit, whether it be mining, whether it be pumping oil with fracking, for example, or whether it be literally tapping all the rivers to the extent that they run out of water. And the classic example would be the Colorado. The Colorado River is one of the main river systems in the Americas, and it flows down from the mountain parts of the Rocky Mountains down through to Mexico. And now, even before the more recent droughts, no water has flowed down to Mexico except in flood times for probably the last 30 years. Because in the western states, Utah, Arizona, notably California, Nevada, etc., they've tapped so much of that water that basically the river runs dry before it gets to Mexico. And Mexico, not surprisingly, has made a huge stink about this, since theoretically you're not supposed to do that. If you remember earlier in the semester, we were talking a little bit about, when you're looking at the Middle East, for example, that you can use water as a strategic way to punish your neighbors in other countries because you basically control the tap. And what you find is in the western provinces in northern Mexico, they don't have any water because the United States sucked it all for swimming pools, washing cars, and fountain features. And so they don't have any water in the country of Mexico because the country of the United States used it for, and about 90% of the time, for incredibly frivolous purposes. So it could be used for food. Instead, it's being used for lawns, washing cars, etc. And that was, and to be honest, Americans didn't care in the sense of U.S. Americans didn't care because it's Mexico. Ironically, what it all of a sudden came to a huge thump was basically 2 features. One is saltation, which I'll give you an image in a second. But the other one is simply the fact that in the last 20 years, the enormous increase in populations in the American Western states have meant that there isn't even enough water for the Western states. So if California gets the water it wants, Nevada doesn't get any. If Nevada gets its water, then California doesn't get very much. And so what you've got is American states competing for water resources and almost getting to gunshots in 2 cases in the last 20 years. And what you get is, of course, with a constant increase in population, is this becomes an ever greater issue. And you can see this classically, you Google something like Lake Powell or Lake Mead right now, which are 2 of the large reservoir water storage systems of these western rivers. And you find that they're both basically dry. And those were enormously deep, absolutely huge bodies of water, both artificially and man-made, whose purpose was to store water for human use in the Western states. And we've used so much of it, there's no water left. And ironically, what you don't get is water conservation. In most cases, what you get is people screaming, I should get the water and you should just suffer. So there's no coherent agreement on how the water should be stored or used. A lot of it's tied to this, I think I mentioned last time, with this idea of a profit. If you have water used for drinking purposes, then you lose the water features in the lawn. So all of a sudden someone's house isn't worth as much money when they try to sell it because it doesn't have a viable lawn. And your water features in Las Vegas won't work because the fountains aren't there. So all of a sudden the number of gamblers and tourists will go down. And so what you find is this all gets folded into this whole idea of profit. And the rather terrifying part missing out of this is the whole idea of, well, what are you doing to the natural surroundings of this area by virtue of literally stripping rivers of their entire water supply so they can go for a couple of 100 miles with no water left in them? How do you change that ecosystem and the whole biota? How are you changing global warming and all the rest of it when you use water in such strange ways? So let's stop here while I go flip over to this other here. Okay, here we see from an environmental standpoint the nightmare of profit, what I would, for lack of a better term. We're now south of Fresno, California. This is the Central Valley. This is considered the actual one of the 5 or 6 richest agricultural zones on the planet. It's by far the richest in the entire United States. And it so happens, let me just zoom out here a little bit. What you basically have is waters coming off of these rivers collected by the Sierra Nevada range to the east and your coastal range to the west. And in the middle, you have what used to be a sea. And basically it's a pocket, and that's your what's called the Central Valley. And it just so happens by virtue of the land material, especially nutrients and stuff down here captured in this area, it was actually quite dry originally. So most of it was desert or near desert. In fact, here's Death Valley over here, I think. And so it's an area that's quite dry, but actually the soil is quite rich. So in the mid and late 19th century, when European Americans started to settle in this area, prior to that, had been largely ranches. What they did is one of the things they started doing is farming here, and then basically tapping the river systems that exist in California, and also bringing in water from the Colorado over here, and basically irrigating this area. So this area is incredibly rich in terms of agriculture, but it's not because there's water there. So it's not like, say, China being on the Huanghe or the Yangtze River. This is agriculture because you've imported the water. Now, one of the side effects of this then is, because this is actually a catchment system, is that when you put water in the ground from sprinklers or whatever, the water doesn't go somewhere else. The water just sort of stays there and it just sort of soaks into the rocks. And so what happens is that over time, because the water's not moving, it's also not taking, nutrients or pollutants or whatever else don't leave. They just sort of stay in there. So if you want to visualize, it's like a giant stagnant pool. On one hand, that stagnant pool generates an enormous amount of food because you're planting in there, but also because it doesn't go anywhere. That thing just over time, just whatever was there just ends up there. And what's happened in this area is, if we look in here, zoom in, you can see we've got this whole area gridded out. All of this was farmland. So all of this was irrigated. And in fact, if we zoom in here, we can probably see the irrigation patterns. Yeah. In fact, you can see parts of the old patterns. So this is all, I don't know what it is. It's, something. It could be sugar beets, could be, potatoes. Who knows? Whatever. Just make it, make your own up. But what happened was, because they were irrigating this area so heavily, is because each of these are basically, these are farming plots. So these folks are in the business of making money. So these are profit-oriented farms. So people are using, we'll say, these 6 units here, because the more food they grow, the more money they make. It's a real simple proposition. And so what happens is, over time, the climate being what it is, you can put in 2 crops a year. But the problem is, if you put in 2 crops a year, you start to actually use the nutrients up in this area. And of course, there aren't any new nutrients coming in because there's no water coming here normally. So what you do is you start to use fertilizers, and you start to use more and more fertilizers because you realize maybe if you grow something else, now you can grow 3 crops a year. And so what happens is you start pushing this way beyond what Mother Nature ever intended, because it was intended to be sort of like desert. And the end result is, what happens is you end up with making enormous amounts of money, because it's incredibly rich farmland. But also what happens over time is it gets saltation, which means basically as over time, because the water's evaporating, but your phosphates, your nitrates, your fertilizers and stuff aren't disappearing, as they turn into salts. And the irony is, what they do is they eventually make this entire poisonous. So what you do is you're poisoning your own farm. And over time, what then happens is basically you end up with a farm that cannot grow anything. It becomes totally toxic. And all of this is farmland that was farmland that isn't farmland anymore because it's going salt. Southern California is losing an enormous proportion. If you look at this area here, this was all farmland. The vast majority isn't. It's gone back into its natural form, and it's reverting back to desert or close to desert. In some cases, completely reverting back to desert. And the ironic thing is now is because the desert is, because of human intervention, fertilization and over irrigation, it's now dead. The desert that was here prior to the farming, prior to the 1850s, 1880s, was a desert because of the lack of moisture. We've now killed a large part of the Central Valley, and it's actually the fastest rapidly disappearing area of agriculture in the United States, and one of the faster ones in the world. The irony is, if you're one of these guys and you have one of these farms, as you're losing your outside areas because you need to keep making a profit, you don't sit there and start rethinking how you're going to plant this area. What you do is you plant it even more, because now these 4 units here have to carry, what was a 12 square unit farm is now down to say 3. And so these areas have to be planted more if you want to make as much money as you did, or more money than you did 10 or 50 or 100 years ago. And of course, the more you do that, the more you push this into turning into that. The United States is one of the best examples of environmental stupidity on the planet. And it's entirely self-induced. And it's hugely self-induced by this idea of profit. That on one hand, if I'm a farmer and I ruin this property, okay, I leave. I can't farm here anymore. I sell it and I move on, turn into something else, become an IT guy or something. That land's dead. That land's going to be dead for thousands of years. So what I did with my property has implications way beyond just me. And this is something we have a huge time grasping in the United States, whether it be discussions about wearing masks, COVID, or all this is the idea of individual rights versus collective rights. And in the environmental sector, it's probably the nightmare of the United States, I would argue, is the fact that individual rights mean that you basically can destroy a whole part of the United States, which provides and generates food not only for the United States, but other places because of the desire for individual profit. I'm not sure what the answer is. I would argue that a lot of it just has to do sort of with the concept of wake-up call. I would point out that places like Japan do not have the same problem. Even China does a much better job of controlling or monitoring its physical resources. But in the United States, since everyone's a migrant, everyone's been here, some of these farmers, my family showed up in 1880, so they've been there for a long time. No, I'm sorry, that's not a long time. In China, that family might have been in that property for 2,000 years. You might have been there since the 1880s, but you'll hear people say frequently, I'll be the last generation that's working this farm because it's going to salt. Well, dude, why do you hell think that's happening? So environmental degradation due to the desire for profit, whether it be fracking, whether it be open coal mining, whether it be over farming land, is an enormous problem in the United States. And it's a perceptual problem, it's a legal problem, and most importantly, it's an American problem. So it's not a geopolitics, it's an American political discussion that we just don't want to have, and so we just don't have it. It's one of the surreal aspects of the American logic is this idea of rights, and the idea that somehow collective rights don't exist because everyone's a migrant. So for the vast majority of the population, there's no sense of relationship to the land. This we see here in Hawaii, of course, to a striking extent, because Hawaii has a lot of these discussions in a much more vocal way. Mauna Kea being a good example, but there's a ton of these examples around here. But on the mainland, what you frequently find is the other groups complaining, for example, the University of Arizona put out their telescopes on one of the mountains there, is that mountain's totally sacred to the Dene, you might call them as Navajo, and some of the Apache populations. But no one cared. To the larger population in the state of Arizona and stuff like that, it was irrelevant compared to the University of Arizona wanting to put up a telescope. So that discussion didn't take place because 99% of the population didn't give a squat. So when those of you that are interested in environmental affairs, this is a huge problem you have. Americans get very interested in environmental affairs for just long enough to post a thumbs up on an Instagram or a Snapchat tweet or something like that, but they don't do anything, especially if it gets in the way of profit. And the last thing then, of course, is if we are from somewhere else, then your identity tends to be very, very much tied to your ethnic, family genealogy, history, background, rather than your relationship with place. So, for example, on one side of my family, we're actually Californians, and we've been there for 6 generations. So the family's been there for a long time. And in Europe or most of the rest of the world, that would be our major source of identity. But for my family, which is a classic American family, it's sort of like, yeah, that's sort of an interesting part of social trivia, but it's not a strong sense of who we are. So ethnicity in the United States is a rapidly changing thing. If you've watched the video, even more so in some ways in Canada. And I think the interesting thing is in the United States, and to a lesser extent in Canada, there's sort of an assumption in the last 40 years that ethnicity was something that happened somewhere else. So in Europe, you have this rise of ethnic identity. And I think Americans sort of looked at it with, well, the Europeans are going weird again, or they're going back to being Europeans or whatever. But there was sort of this can't happen in my backyard concept. And the enormous growth in identity groups in the United States. Oftentimes ethnic, but oftentimes just based on sort of, group social values, siloing, for example, which is a huge part of the American political discussion right now in 2022, is based on this idea that the collective is only as large as you want it to be. It's not a collective based on national boundaries. It's not a collective based on language you speak. It's sort of hard to figure out what the collective is. This is even more true in Canada. And so what you get is who people are and who they see themselves as, and more importantly, who they feel themselves responsible to. Who is their group and who's a member of it, who isn't a member of it. It's become a tremendously fragmenting influence in the United States in the last 10 years, especially. In Canada, even more so, because in Canada, the various provinces have the right, if they can get a majority vote, they have a right to actually leave Canada, which of course in the United States was the whole issue behind the Civil War in 1861. So you can't do that in the United States theoretically. In Canada, it's an option. And if you watch that Quebec video, that's what they want. And part of that population wants to turn Canada into basically 3 countries. And if they get a majority vote, which I don't think they will now, but they might, then Canada ceases to exist as a country in the same way that the United Kingdom very likely will cease to exist in a couple of years as a country, as Scotland and Wales leave the UK. You can't do that in the US, but to a certain extent, our political system is already fragmented in a very, very similar way to the French speakers and such in Canada. And of course, the last of this whole fallacy we mentioned earlier, it's just our perpetual growth. The idea that we live in a world where you can always expect things to be more. You can have more. You should be able to have more. You should be able to access more. It should be within your means to do so. Just I know what we call the fallacy of perpetual growth. And of course, this in the Western states, going back to the water thing, this is why you can't control how much water gets used by people, because one, it's their individual right to use the water. And two, you should, of course, under US law, you can live anywhere in the United States you want to. So if the entire population of the United States decided to want to move to California, there's nothing under federal law that could control it. The state of California couldn't do anything. If the entire population of California decides it wants to move to Oahu, there's nothing we can do about it. Never mind the fact that environmentally, it's probably the world's largest disaster. And this is, again, this perpetual growth, because not only will those people move here, but they would expect to have the same or better standard of living than where they moved from, especially if they spent more money on it. Now, of course, one of the side effects of all this is we've moved away from the production economy. Again, if you think of Gary, Indiana, or Detroit, or something like that, where the United States used to be one of the big production centers on the planet. We used to be the China of the early 20th century. We've now left that. We now produce almost nothing in the United States. We have moved to basically call a service or retail economy, where most Americans provide services. And this is why the United States got hit so hard during COVID, because this was a service sector that got hammered the worst. One of the side effects of this is service sector jobs pay very little. And so this is, for example, why if you graduate, if you can't find a job in your particular specialty, you're probably not going to be making very much at all. And that's simply because that's what a service sector economy is. And of course, those of you who grew up here, that is the economy here at Hawaii. One of the side effects that's become a big issue in the United States, though I don't think people are addressing it directly, is when you move to a service sector from a production economy, a huge part of your population actually drops in their standard of living because you no longer have largely a middle class. Middle classes are largely based on production economies. If you move production to service economies, they'll have the folks that own the stores, that own the L&L drivers. They make a lot of money, or ABC stores. But you have all the people that work in those stores, and they don't make squat. And what happens is the folks that were in your middle class, which is the ones that buy houses, put their kids in decent schools like Chaminade, et cetera, are rapidly shrinking. And there's never a growing part of the population which really doesn't have access to a lot of resources that it's maybe the parents used to, but the kids don't, because they don't have those same job options. Because we're now in a retail economy. And that then goes back to this perpetual growth model, because the generation that you guys are a part of is the first generation in something like 70 or 80 years. We are going to probably make less than your parents and have less access to stuff than your parents, statistically, because we moved from production to basically service. And that has enormous social, political, discussions, which we're seeing as a lot of the fraught, dialogue and conflict in the United States is actually based on these other factors, as people suddenly realize that they're not going to have the life of their parents, and they don't know why. And that's not fair. The word fair is fascinating. I should have access to a good job. I should be able to make a good paycheck. Yeah, no one's going to disagree with that, but how? So the United States has an enormous number of internal issues, many of which we haven't really addressed, and many of which, because of our weird situation in terms of being migrant populations, et cetera, makes it probably harder for us to have those discussions in other places where we have more settled populations with a longer historical relationship with their place. the relationship of place in the United States, I would argue, for a large part of the population, the vast majority of the population, is entirely absent. It just doesn't exist. So on that note, I know it's rather not cheery, but that's sort of the last summary of life on planet Earth in the 21st century. And there's nothing that says we can't come to grips with this, but it's going to take a lot of focus on everyone's part to realize that I can't have everything I want unless I'm willing to give up part of what I want so that you can have part of what you want, and we can agree on how we're going to share versus me.